Welcome back, everyone. Could you all please take a seat? We have still some 5 very interesting presentations and a discussion. And only then, and if you behave very nicely, we have drinks afterwards. Chris is going to be the judge upon that. Apparently, because I did a marvelous job in the first session, he asked me to do the timekeeping once again. No, my colleague unfortunately was sick, so I'm filling in her place. Welcome back for the second part of the scientific perspectives. With the first speaker is going to be Frank van Oort. Frank is professor of urban and regional economics at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He has many research interests, and just like Chris said, just tell them about economy, economy, economy. So that's what he's going to do in 15 minutes. So please enjoy his talk.
Thank you for the invitation and thank you for being here. Great to be here. So what role for economics in long-term strategies in redesigning deltas? We already had some discussion before the break, and economics came up a few times because the things that are proposed, the designs, they are usually costly. Usually there are costs, there are benefits. So we talked about redesigning deltas, reimagining governance. So what should we redoing with economics then? Because economics is usually the part that holds back development. Because we make cost-benefit analysis, we look at CPB Netherlands, who actually makes these cost-benefit analysis and decides on where investments should go and where should they not go. And sometimes economics is seen as a very stringent aspect that actually holds back things. But I think economics is a tool that you can use to a very large extent to combine it with design and to give the insights of evidence-based development we were looking for. So 4 roles of economics I'm going to look at. The cost and benefits, of course, it's important to look at it. What are the cost and benefits of urbanization in deltas? Can we imagine, can we calculate how much cities actually contribute to welfare and cities in deltas in specific? So it's important to look at. I will say something how complex that issue actually is. Well, then identification of value. We already discussed before the break, value is important. But can we value things like flooding, like nature and water? What can we say about that and how can we integrate that into a design question? The third one is on resilience, because we talked about the region of South Holland, and specifically Rotterdam, but Rotterdam is the gateway to Europe. So if something happens in South Holland, we also have issues in Germany, we have issues in Eastern Europe. So we have shocks, and shocks transform over value chains through Europe and through the whole world. We see that now with the war in Ukraine, we saw it with Brexit, we saw it with the pandemic. So the issues we look at right now about flooding have the same kind of potential shocks going through value chains, and we have to look at that. And the fourth one is, okay, also economics is moving towards more measurement and more broader interpretation. The term brede welvaart, it's a Dutch term. No one uses it outside the Netherlands. There's not such a thing as broad welfare, not even in Vlaanderen. So everyone uses the term well-being, but it's important to use well-being as an issue to look at. So first, these cost and benefits of urbanizations. If you look at the map of the Netherlands, on the left-hand side, you see a map of the prices of land, determined also by prices of housing. And what you see is that in the Delta region, in the Randstad region, prices are higher. But on the right-hand side, you see a map of average wages that people earn. It's also higher in the Delta. So this is an issue we find in very urbanized Delta areas, that they are very good in economic terms. You get higher wages, but you have to use that wage to make a living in buying housing and having amenities that are much more expensive than elsewhere. So this issue of higher wages and higher prices of land and higher values of houses, that's what ticks urban economics, and that's where our research is about. So if we look at what is agglomeration economies, the fact that larger cities have higher wages and larger cities have higher value of land, we call that agglomeration economies. It's a kind of a miracle term. Everyone uses the term everywhere. And it's about if you double the city size, you actually get 5 to 10% more productivity and higher wages of people. So that is where urban economics is about. And what is then happening in cities that makes people more productive? That's the question where urban economics looks at and tries to explain. And it's not as simple as my colleague in Amsterdam, although nowadays he's in Groningen and in Delft. But he always said, okay, if this is the rule, make your city twice as big and then you have 10% productivity gain, make Amsterdam twice as big. But then he ignores all the feedback loops and all the sorting effects that are actually into this premium of 10% in cities. Because if you look at it, and this is a very complex picture, the agglomeration benefits, they come from different sources. In the top you see it comes from first nature advantage. And the port of Rotterdam is, of course, by example, a first nature advantage. Because we have this port, it is the largest port, it attracts all the industries, it attracts also talented people who work in the port. So I can imagine they were a bit upset with Han Meijer's plan, because there is a lot of endowed industry and services in the port that is related to the economy. So this first nature advantage is important. But then you also have firms sorting out. The best firms sort out in this area because they profit from what we call matching, sharing, and learning opportunities. If they look for good people to work in those factories, they don't have to look far because it's a very dense area. You can always find the right people. And if you are a person looking for a job, you also profit from the density of the city because you can much easily find the good jobs that fit to you. So this is the firm sorting effect. And there's even a quality effect. The best people and the best firms sort themselves out in those areas. And that causes this 5 to 10% productivity growth. And some parts of this growth is actually being paid for, because you pay higher wages for talented people, and some part is not paid for. And that is the real agglomeration effect, that the fact that in certain areas you have much more sharing, matching, and learning without that you have to pay for it. But that's only 2 to 5% of this upgrade. So if we talk about what makes cities in urban deltas now so productive and so helpful for economic growth, there's a lot of reasoning here. Sorting of people, sorting of firms, first nature advantage, second nature advantage. All these issues we can disentangle nowadays because we use large data sets. And we didn't do that in the past. So economic success of urban deltas, it comes from this first nature advantage. If you don't have that, you have to create the first nature advantage yourself. And the Port of Rotterdam is a major big one. Although some people say we don't have one big city, but we have a set of smaller cities, so we are polycentric. But still we can borrow size from each other and still act as if we are one large city. So producers actually have advantages because they don't have to look far for good staff. And people don't have to look far for good jobs. Then we have the infrastructures, the houses, the amenities, and it also breeds innovation. So if we value all these things, and organizations like Smartport and the City of Rotterdam and Innovation Quarter, they try to value these things, yes, then you know how dependent you are on good accessibility. So I can understand they got worried about plans to change infrastructures or to change the setup of urban issues. Of course, there are also agglomeration disadvantages, like congestion and higher housing prices, but the advantages are still bigger than the disadvantages, otherwise we would not still see the growth we have. All these aspects are called external effects, external to the firm. Not one firm can actually influence this, but the fact that you have so many firms together and so many people together creates this advantage. And this advantage we have to cherish, because it sets you apart from all the other urban regions in the world that also try to gain from their advantages. So we know now that there are costs and benefits related to urbanization, and urbanization as such is an interesting way to look at it. But can we identify exactly the value? How do we look at that? First nature, we can of course value much, but accessibility, spatial quality, and water should also be valued. And we see recently that we have more and more techniques and methodologies to measure this. So these are 3 researchers. 2 of them were done by the Centraal Planbureau, and 1 of them I did with Erasmus University and the Planbureau of the Leefomgeving. It's about the introduction of new infrastructure. For instance, on the top left you see the introduction of the E-line, So first, there was no E-line. The area was not very good accessible. You introduced the new metro line from Rotterdam to The Hague, and you can measure how much house prices actually increase in value. And actually, we calculated that the increase in house value was so much, you could actually pay the whole line from it. If you actually then make a tax and get the house price somehow, because not everyone uses the E-line, not everyone profits from it, but you could pay it from it. And in the same way, they looked at infrastructural projects in Delft, and they looked at infrastructural projects in Maastricht, where they make a big tunnel and put the highway under the ground. So people value their living environment. It's not always explicit how they value it, because it's in the housing price. You can see it in that. You have to control for the fact that all houses become more expensive over time, and we have quite a crisis there. But then you can really identify what is the value of these issues. So we need big data for that, and we need quite some methods to do this, but we can prove it. And we also prove that, this is the statement from Centraal Planbureau saying, if there is something to gain, we should actually transfer the money that is gained to the people who need it most. It's a political issue. You would not expect CPB to say this, but they made actually a political statement here. But we did the same also with flooding risks. Areas that can be flooded versus areas that cannot be flooded. The same house in a flooded versus a non-flooded area and potential area, and see what the house price difference is. And it turns out, in this article from my colleagues in Erasmus University, that there is an implicit price markup already visible. Houses that are safe are much more expensive, controlled for all other factors, than houses that are not safe. And this is only an implicit. We now do the same kind of research, of course, in the south of Limburg, in Belgium, and in Germany, where they had the flooding, and there you can actually see how much of this anticipated value effect is in housing prices. And you can actually, if you calculate one house, and then you calculate with all the houses which are there, you can actually estimate how much value is involved. And it's an enormous amount of value, a very large value. So it's important to look at. So looking at direct and indirect effects costs of flooding, this is a diagram from some research. There are a lot of impacts. Direct impacts, but also indirect impacts that have to do with all these linkages over the markets that are impacted. And there is still this thing that has never been conceptualized in these models, this flywheel of 5 to 10% extra gain you get from an agglomeration economy. It's not in these models, but if you lose that out, and other regions in the world do not lose out on this 5–10%, then your competitive advantage is going to deteriorate. So that is the wicked problem about how to go about value creation, value capturing, and also how much value is actually involved. So that's what we try to measure in our economic analysis. But that's not everything. I already told you, South Holland is one part of a chain. Things coming from China go to Rotterdam, then go to Germany. Rotterdam is a very strong chain, but it's also a very vulnerable chain. Because if this chain somehow drops out of the value chain, you have a big issue. Germany has an issue, China will have an issue. We see that all around with all the shocks we investigated lately. So we investigated Brexit, the Ukraine war, and now we also investigate what happens if the area of Rotterdam is flooded. Well, there's a lot of direct effects on agricultural productivity, on impact on land values, impact on investment, impact on housing, impact on employment. Again, there is this loop of 5 to 10% that will be deteriorated. So your engine drops out. It's important to realize there's an issue there. And the other thing is, this is something we can do for all shocks. We also do research this for all shocks. We use what we call input-output analysis. What we get from China, and it is reused in products in Germany, there is a linkage, and if somewhere on this linkage there is a disruption, we saw that already one boat being stuck in the Suez Canal can already be a huge disruption for many industries. So this model we can actually apply to a lot of disruptions. And what you see, if South Holland, so Rotterdam area, would be flooded for one reason or another, we didn't look at probability, all the regions that are showing up red here in this map are affected. because they don't get the right products in the right time for their production processes. So they have huge problems. And the longer this takes, the longer this issue will be. So the natural reaction of governments like Mr. Johnson in the UK is, why the hell are we so dependent on these value chains? Let's make all these things ourselves. And that's why he said Brexit is good for us, because we can make things ourselves and we don't need the European Union for that. But this is the cheapest way to organize it. Otherwise, we would already have changed into another system. So if you change it differently, you have to pay a lot of money. You have to give up welfare. You have to give up well-being. So we have to realize, if we want to implement different strategies, different kind of value chains, different kind of vulnerabilities, different kind of protection of areas, it will cost you something. On the spot in your city, but also in the value chain elsewhere in Europe and in the rest of the world. So the last thing is about what we also heard before the break. There are much more things that people value. Hey, we value GDP, income, being employed, but we also actually value safety, and we value health, and we value all kinds of other things. So that's why we introduce something like broad welfare, brede welvaart, well-being. And economists are really debating that now. Is that something we can measure? How much are people prepared to pay for good health? What are they prepared to give up for it? And it has to also do with what we call mission economy. I had a debate a few weeks ago with Mariano Mazzucato. He wrote a book about missions, about being healthy, being safe, being all the Sustainable Development Goals, 18, I believe there are 13 there are, and she says these are all important missions. But these missions are also costly. So this book by Mrs. Mazzucato, it actually suggests it is so costly, the only one who can pay this is the state, is the government. So we need government intervention here, because firms cannot pay for the big missions. The big missions she actually identified as moonshots. 2 slides, so I'm going to manage. But there are quite some limitations also in measuring this, because mission economy and quality of life, it's very much about sustainability. It's about what do we do for the generation now and in the future, here and in other places. That's exactly the definition of sustainable development. But then we run into what was also by Professor van Buren meant the wicked problems. If you want health, if you want safety, if you want GDP, they do not always align together. That would be ideal, but we have trade-offs, and we have things that are linked with each other. And we have to find out what is really linked with what. So we did some research with students on Erasmus University, having all these dimensions of broad welfare, and how does flooding actually impact on all these individual aspects. And some aspects are positive, and some aspects are negative in the scenarios we can use. So retreat or protect are different scenarios, and they have different impacts on all the issues that people value. And this gives you information, not to choose, but to give you information about what is valued and what will be impacted, what is linked with each other and what is linked against each other once you choose for certain aspects. So the last slides, economics. Our minister says which we should not discuss if it is haalbaar or betaalbaar, but it is an argument. It is costly. We cannot all pay things all together at once, so it is normal that we actually discuss costs, we discuss benefits, but then at least we should identify as much as possible the benefits we can actually try to gain. Then the last slide, yes, I use a lot of data, I use a lot of models, and models are wrong, but they give you insight, because they give you the restrictions, they give you the feedback loops, and they give you the things that work against each other. And that insight is important if you want to make political decisions. So this is about economics in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Our next speaker is Tim van Hatten. He's a program leader, Green Climate Solutions, Environmental Sciences Group at Wageningen University and Research. And together with colleagues, he developed a nature-based future for the Netherlands. The map was already shown this morning. And Tim conducts research into climate adaptation, water management, and urban climate. And among other things, he researches the importance of greening cities to increase the sponginess and livability of the city. The floor is yours, Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation to speak here at this important conference, I think. Well, like Alan said, with a group of almost 20 researchers, we developed a vision of how we think the Netherlands can look like in 100 years when we take nature-based solutions as a starting point. And well, in 15 minutes, which is almost impossible, I will take you into that future. But let me start with today. This picture pretty much represents the world today. You could say the world is on fire and we are still playing a game of golf. We are very busy with short-term problems and we are running from one crisis into the other. COVID, a housing crisis, a nitrogen crisis, a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. And well, we are very busy with these short-term problems, but we need, of course, to think much more in the long term. So we need to have a long-term perspective. And yeah, we all know that climate change is the biggest challenge of this time. We see it happening all over the place. Heat waves, wildfires, floods. The picture on the right on top is a severe flood in China last year. And of course, we had our own wake-up call in the southern part of the Netherlands, in Limburg. The Geul was flooded, was already mentioned by Bas. I was almost born in the Geul, so I know that this place pretty good. And it's challenging. So we really need to focus on climate adaptation. Well, the IPCC report highlighted the importance of climate adaptation. It is, and I don't have to explain that here, but we really need to put much more effort in climate adaptation finance and action. And well, one of the messages of the IPCC report was also that nature-based solutions is also really an important part of this adaptation strategy. But if we reach over the 1.5 degree, some of these nature-based solutions might not work anymore. So we really need to put effort on adaptation. And if you ask people, how do you think the Netherlands will look like in 100 years? There are, well, a lot of people think that our country will be flooded. We have seen these pictures today a lot of times. But that also makes people scared for the future. So we really need to also show the way we have to go. But climate change is a big challenge. But on top of that, we have a biodiversity crisis. In 2019, a very important report of IPBES was published, showing that 1 million species are about to extinct. And well, this is also really, really important. So we need an integrated strategy because the causes of the biodiversity crisis are pretty much the same as the causes of the climate crisis. So we really need an integrated strategy. We have to focus on climate mitigation, reduce the emissions towards net zero in 2050, focus on adaptation, but we have to do that in an integrated way by restoring and protecting nature. And that is where nature-based solutions come in. We are focusing a lot, if we talk about climate change, we are focusing a lot on technical solutions. And we all need these technical solutions, but we also need to start working with nature much more. Our soils, our water systems, our forests, our wetlands are the best climate solutions we have. And we are now really declining all these, the potential of these nature-based solutions. So we have to start protecting and restoring nature. And that for us was the starting point to say, can we design a nature-based future? Can we think how a nature-based future of the Netherlands would look like? So we actually need a new narrative for our country, a country that is not flooded in 100 years, but takes this nature-based perspective as a starting point. Well, this picture made by André Kuipers, I was in a meeting with him yesterday, our astronaut, showing a vulnerable country, a low-lying delta, densely populated with a lot of challenges. We need to focus on the energy transition. We want to move towards a bio-based and circular economy. We have big problems with our food production at the moment. We have a nitrogen crisis, so we really need to redesign our food system. And we still want to build 1 million houses in this very small and populated country. So we need a long-term perspective of how we are going to redesign the Netherlands. So what we did is, together with 18 experts of different fields, so hydrologists, ecologists, marine biologists, economists, landscape architects, all kinds of expertise in the room, we started to work with research by design to redesign how our country could look like. And we first started to define new guiding principles for redesigning the Netherlands. And we said, okay, the natural system, so our land, our soils, our landscape, our water systems should be the starting point for redesigning our country. We also said water is really important. Our country is designed to get rid of the water as soon as possible to prevent floods. But we start seeing that it's causing several problems, drought problems. So we have to retain, reuse, store our water before we drain it into the sea. We also want to move towards a circular and climate-positive economy. We need an adaptive spatial planning, and we also want to move towards a nature-inclusive society, where with everything we do, we start thinking of what will be the impact of nature, and how can we restore nature instead of destroy it. Well, with these guiding principles, we start designing and drawing and showing how we think our country could look like. And, well, we came up with a new map of the country. It was also shown by Han Meijer this morning. Just to show how we think our country could look like. And, well, let's see if this works. Whoa, this is cool. So but there's a lot of information on this map, and well, I don't have time to explain everything, but we made some very important assumptions, and one of them, we are talking about sea level rise a lot. We said, okay, in 2120, we think the sea level will be 1.5 meters. Of course, we don't know; nobody knows exactly, but the assumption was 1.5 meters of sea level rise. And then, well, we turned the map to give you another perspective of the Netherlands. And normally we see our country in another way, but we really need to think in a different way. But we also wanted to show that the sea is also a big part of the Netherlands and also a part of the solution. So we really have to start thinking in another way. And it shows a country with much more room for water, much more green, much more wetlands, much more forest, a totally different food system. Well, and what we actually did is create strategies for every natural system. So we have clay soils, we have coastal areas, we have peatlands, we have urban areas, we have higher sandy soils. And these all need a different kind of strategy to redesign towards the future. Well, let me zoom into some of these places. Well, at sea, we start producing much more energy, of course. That's already happening. Wind energy, but also floating solar, hydrogen hubs. But we can also start producing much more food at sea. Oysters, mussels, seaweed. Well, of course, we need coastal protection to prevent us from flooding. So you have to accommodate this 1.5 meter of sea level rise. We also want much more space for rivers, and not only for the big rivers, which we have been talking about already, but also for the small rivers. We were talking about the river de Geul, which caused flooding problems. We need much more space also for the small rivers. We also need to restore our wetlands. our peatlands are subsiding. So land subsidence is going faster than the sea level is rising. And this combination is really, really bad. So restoring our wetlands, we can also store all the carbon in there instead of carbon emissions that are causing these peatlands at the moment. Well, and also we want, of course, to have green and healthy cities. So also our cities become much more green, and we extract nature into our cities. That's not only good for the climate resilience of these cities, but also for the well-being of the people living in that cities. And we also have to think where we want to build these cities. We saw this afternoon 800,000 houses are being built in vulnerable places. So we have to rethink where we want to build. And we said, actually, we have to look towards the higher areas to build our houses. Well, we presented this story, this nature-based narrative for the future of the Netherlands 2 years ago. I think almost 2.5 years ago. And it was picked up very fast by the Dutch media. So all the newspapers were talking about it. It was on the TV. De Groene Amsterdammer made a very special edition about the future of the Netherlands. And well, most proud we are that we reached the Linda, because then you really have impact. But the question is, why do people like this narrative, and why is it so important? And we really think that there is a very high need for a narrative of hope, a hopeful future. There are so much alarming messages of how we think the future will look like, that there is a huge need for designing evidence-based designs of a hopeful future. Well, the main question is, well, if this is the future we want, we are not the ones who decide that, by the way. So this is not a plan, it's not a blueprint, it's just a narrative to inspire and to put the discussion about the importance of nature-based solutions on the table. That was our aim. But we have spoken to many people and organizations and ministries and all kinds of organizations, and there's a lot of enthusiasm to move into this direction. So the question is how we are going to get there. And we really need to develop pathways how we will move in that direction. Well, this picture is coming from the latest IPCC report. You might have seen it. And what I like about it, it's showing several pathways to the future. And I think at the moment we are focusing very much on the red lines. We are focusing very much on the alarming, negative pathways, the future we don't want, actually. Well, and that is getting us into the direction of a flooded country, and I think most of us don't want that. So I think we have to put much more effort in designing pathways towards the future we want. And if we reach this picture or another picture, that doesn't matter. But I think we have to, as a community here, with all kinds of experts we have, use the design effort to develop pathways to a nature-based future we want. I think that is really important. Well, we learned some lessons of this exercise, actually. Well, I think most important is there's a strong need for a long-term, solution-oriented perspective, not only in the Netherlands, but also in Europe and beyond. I think we can do these kind of exercises for every delta in the world. Research by design is an effective approach. Putting a lot of experts of different fields together and start thinking about what kind of solutions we see for the future. And visualizing a nature-based future can also help to raise awareness for the potential of nature-based solutions. I think the trick of showing this map and showing designs is that everybody understands it. Even my mother-in-law understands it. So I think that's really important, and we have to keep doing that. Well, I think we cannot only do that for the Netherlands. I think we can do that for every delta in the world. That's, I think, as a community, as we sit here, we can design nature-based futures for every delta. And why don't we start do it?
Thank you, Tim, and right on time.
Yeah, oh, that's good.
Yeah, you were worried, but...
Yeah.
Our next speaker, I have to check, is Derek already in the... there you are. Sorry, I didn't look for a long time. Sorry about that. So our next speaker is Derek Loorbach. Derek is Director of Drift and Professor of Socio-Economic Transitions and the Faculty of Social Science, both at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. You are also one of the founders of the transition management approach as a new form of governance for sustainable development. And with that said...
Thank you. Good afternoon. Happy to be here. I guess you're also a bit tired of all the sequence of presentations. I'm going to add yet another one. I'm trying to make it entertaining. So let me start with a provocation. I think research by design is not the solution. It's part of the problem. So I hope you're awake now. And it's only partly serious. What I'm going to try to do is talk about 50 minutes about the how of these kind of transition, because I like these maps, but they are also pictures we can make and life goes on. Right, so we can make these kind of alternative futures, but how do we actually translate these pictures into actual transformative change? I've been involved in the IPBES discussions. There you see that slowly we are moving from fighting biodiversity loss towards nature positive ideas. For me, I'm a social scientist, so I'm not an ecologist, I'm also not a designer. My background is more in political science and, let's say, social learning. And for me, transitions are a process of deep transformative social innovation. So we need to start to think, work, and organize ourselves in a different way. Otherwise, we are sitting here having these kinds of conversations in 30 years. Actually, not here because, well, you know. And that's I mean, I can start again also with the doom and gloom stories, but the main question we have to ask ourselves, we have all the knowledge, we know the examples, there's like tons of policymakers and public administration scholars studying how to make policy, but it basically didn't change anything. It created a whole industry of sustainability consultants, policy departments, stacks of paper, climate conferences. We travel all over the world to discuss the problem while life goes on. And that's the same, and these are the people that are running it. So this is the G20 in Rome. Actually, they were discussing climate, and they are throwing coins for good luck in the Trevi fountain, which basically sums it up, I would say. Yeah, and you're laughing, but I think it's also painful, right? Because obviously none of them is truly interested in the deep kind of transformative change that will move us away from an extractive economy upon which their positions are being built. And they are symbols of an economic system that is sort of rooted in the Industrial Revolution. It's basically based on a linear mindset. We take things out of the earth and we transform it into money, basically. And that accumulates with a relatively small part of the population, and the rest of us need to consume more and more and more to bring up the taxes to increase the wealth. What is more important here, because we shouldn't go into the full-on post-capitalist conversation here, is the logic that is driving this. So the terms on the left, they refer to the way that we are conditioned as human beings. Our university is also educating people in this way, you could say, but our institutions are built to improve what we already have and to do that in a controlled way. So to take an existing situation and try to come up with innovations to make it better. Designers often, and more an escape. Let's try to escape that situation, but what we saw the last 2-3 years, that's the last point here, it's also very difficult to imagine that things really change. So we can have these stories of big floodings, but we cannot really imagine what it means until we experience it. So a lot of these future images, a lot of these alternative futures, people maybe get inspired or shocked, but when they go back to their job or to their home or to their everyday life, life goes on. So we are trapped basically in a condition where we have all these expertise and all our institutional powers geared towards making the existing better. And that leads to problems. And we know, I mean, all these shocks or disruptions, COVID on top of it, for us, they are signals of something more fundamental. And whether we want transitions or not, they are happening. So transitions, it's a concept that is present in a lot of academic disciplines, in ecology, but also in physics, in demographic studies. In a societal context, it refers to a nonlinear system change that takes place over a period of decades. So they are really long-term changes that over time accumulate to a revolutionary change. We say they are evolutionary revolutions. So they're not overnight, but gradually, over time, when we look back, we can acknowledge or see the evidence that we've made a major leap. I say here, transition is a process out of equilibrium because in essence, that's what it is. We're so comfortable in our current situation, we keep improving it, but a transition is really the process that we are pushed out of equilibrium, which is uncomfortable, because then a new future opens or a new pathway that is fundamentally uncertain. We cannot control it, we cannot predict it. So we are entering a period of societal turmoil that has uncertain outcomes, let's put it like that. Which is also why there's a lot of resistance. Companies feel it, governments feel it, population feel it. The uncertainty of systemic change is undesirable for 80-90% of the population. So we resist change. Also as individuals, we all have bad behaviors. We know we should change it, but maybe tomorrow, right? So how we understand transitions, and there's a whole complex systems storyline behind it, but this figure sums it up in a very simplistic way. It's basically a process where a lot of the established ways of doing, thinking, and organizing are pushed out of equilibrium with all the resistance and turmoil that comes with it. That's the top left. Oh, I never had this. But at the same time, obviously, there's a lot of people doing things differently. So while in the 70s, the engineers started with solar panels, obviously we were still massively building fossil infrastructures. What happens over time is as more and more people start to feel this is not working, we need to make a change. There is more and more doubt also in society about how we are moving along. More and more people start to join alternatives. And the idea of this figure is not to be predictive, but to illustrate this co-evolutionary dynamic and the fact that transformative change is this process out of equilibrium where a lot of things also disappear. And they should, I could add, from my normative agenda of where we want to go on the top right, But obviously, this part of the transition is not something that people like. So in our discussions with our national government, for example, they want a circular, fully circular economy and a emission-free energy system, but they don't want to get away from the taxes on production and consumption, for example. Or they want to reduce nitrogen, but they still want to keep Schiphol open and increase flying. They want to, now they finally start to do something about farming and the food system in the Netherlands, but obviously it becomes political the more you move to the center. So how to deal with that? And I'll come now to the how part, because if we anticipate these disruptions ahead, so basically transitions are expected surprises, more and more we will experience this turmoil. We can see it in a negative way, but it also actually opens up institutional and societal space to start imagining these pictures Tim, for example, showed to become real. They actually become more realistic in the sense of the alternatives emerging, but also the space that is there. So it requires indeed a design type of approach or logic, both in terms of imagining the alternatives, but more importantly, in terms of mobilizing this process of societal innovation that's already ongoing. We don't need to invent it. We are talking about transitions because it's happening. And there's massive amounts of people hidden in institutions, policymakers, people in organizations, in businesses that are feeling this and are open to change. But there's also massive amounts of alternative practices, niches, ideas that have emerged and have matured. And the challenge is, how do we develop a critical mass? Not from the industrial mindset of scaling and uniformity and standardization, but with a complexity mindset of translocality, diversity, self-organization. So these are some of the principles we use, and we try to translate it within our institute in transition management to sort of a transition strategy. Basically, you need to do 4 things. Make very explicit the radical transitions. Tim also referred to it. Sort of develop the critical mass and build up these alternative systems. It's about the political process of destabilizing the present, so challenging business as usual, confronting people. Are you part of making the existing better or actually helping transformative change? And it's about managed decline. There's a lot of stuff we know we shouldn't do, like build 800,000 houses in vulnerable areas. So I'm one of the 4 curators of the architectural biennial. It's a 2-yearly event in Rotterdam. We only have half a year, so it's a bit of a pressure cooker. One of the things that we're doing is I work with a landscape designer, Peter Veenstra from Lola, landscape architects, to actually take research by design to the next phase. Architectural biennial is also about research by design. Do these nice lab settings. You have the professionals and you create perfect images, and then there's nobody there, basically. Well, the media, you create a lot of fuss. So we want to sort of add a layer to that, because the strength of these images and the professionality and the process is fantastic, but it needs an audience and it needs sort of a purpose. And the purpose is radical transitions. So localizing the economy. It's about cities in which you don't need your own car. It's about houses that are nature positive, not nature inclusive, but are actually a carbon sink and help restore biodiversity. It's about the countryside and the transformation there. We need regenerative food systems. And it's about ecological infrastructure. I want to give an example. One of the ateliers that we're working on, and hopefully some people here are involved. On the one hand, there's the whole Delta program, and redesigning deltas for us would be part of the biennial. We're discussing that in which way. That's a lot from the ecological perspective, and that's also what Tim described. At Drift, we are working a lot with the port organization, the port company. They are also working on transition. And in the whole port industrial complex, which is completely fossil and linear, at least they're moving, but still largely, they also have their transition program. An interesting challenge now here in the Delta is, can we synchronize the economic transition towards a circular, renewable, bio-based economy with the ecological transition that is happening. And the interesting thing is in between is the Nieuwe Waterweg, 150 years old today. It's like the icon of industrial progress. It's like an industrial sewer, but it's not sustainable. And on both sides we know that. But these are two completely separate communities, separate ways of thinking, and so on. So how do we want to do it? I'll stop in a minute. Yeah. And I want to challenge you. I hope there are some designers, at least there's sort of design thinking here. For the IABR, the biennial, we defined 3 attitudes. The activist tried to disrupt the timeline. We need to escape from this linear progress. That's the activist. The second is the ancestor. We need to reconnect to old practices. We need to sort of take the 7th generation in the future as our starting point. So it's really a deep time design. And the third attitude is the accelerator. It's basically the idea that we take these radical futures and the possibilities of new technologies, new practices, and bring them closer to the present. With these 3 attitudes, what we try to do is to transform the research by design, to really take a transition approach, mobilize what's already possible out there, to bring together communities of transition practitioners and ideas around a narrative of radical transition, like in the port, and then apply the research by design really to support the agenda of this community. And I think that's what we need, the designers, the governance experts, to work together to mobilize radical transitions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dirk. Last but not least, our final speaker of today, Paula Vigano. She's an architect and an urbanist. She's also professor in urban theory and urban design at both EPFL in Lausanne and at IUHV, Venice. And she founded her architectural studio with Bernardo Secchi in 1990. And since 2015, she's been working on urban and landscape projects with her studio, putting forth explorative and frontier work in ecological challenges in urban landscapes. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this occasion. Again, I can say that the day was very full of questions. So let me conclude. Coming back to this important concept of resilience, I noticed that today the word was not so much used in respect to what is usually the case. So maybe it's good to come back at the end. So I choose this title because I want to discuss how designing resilient spaces for a resilient territory we can enter the core of the modern mechanism of resistance. And we can dismantle this. And eventually we can reframe or rethink a relation between resilience and resistance locally. Designing resilient spaces remains, till today, I think, a disruptive tool that criticizes the order of things, the order of territorial organization, of established priorities, and of hierarchies. So let's say it's quite a fundamental point. I will use two cases. One is related to student work we developed with the European Master in Urbanism 2 years ago, and then a recent and still ongoing work in a territory to try to understand this disruptive power of resilience. So Amphibia is a counter project for a territory that you can maybe recognize. There is Venice there, but I prefer to use this term of Amphibia. You know that Venice organized, the Republic of Venice organized immense works in order to protect the lagoon, so the rivers were diverted. Maybe it's good also to know that the lagoon is inhabited. There are people, there are contemporary economies, there are practices. It's not just a kind of monument. And that, of course, the lagoon is under threat. And also here we have tipping points. So if the sea level rise will be more than 50 centimeters, it will be, say, beyond control, the situation. Which means that to remain before that, all the planet should go for to remain inside the 1.5 degrees, which means that if we want to save Venice, we have to save the planet. There is no other way to save Venice. The lagoon, as I said, is under threat for many different reasons, from many different risks. I'm not going to elaborate. This is a section showing a little bit the evolving morphology of the lagoon with the new, say, the canals, the difference in levels that are modifying the development and the function of the lagoon. And there are several scenarios. We made a research interrogating all the experts, or say all, many of the experts that are working on the lagoon. And let's say the three scenarios are: the first, close the lagoon, so something that in Holland you already know. The second is so to transform in a lake, in fact, the lagoon. The second is to close only the parts where you have to really to protect for also cultural reasons, so where Venice is included, but to open the central part in order to maintain the harbor activities that are in fact on the inland. And there is a third scenario, that is the one on which we have tried to work, in which we decide, also following what scientists were telling us. Basically, they were saying, we don't know how to save Venice. We don't know. So scientists, they don't know. And you have to work on this idea that you don't know, in fact. And design maybe can be a way to experiment, to go through this uncertain condition, and maybe help not in finding a safe place, but at least to clarify certain possible directions. So in this scenario, as you see, you have to imagine, for example, to stop the sediment outflow. That is a fundamental problem of the lagoon. And the progressive salinization, you have to close the three inlets, the three mouths that you see on the side of the Lido. Because they are today drastically accelerating the water exchanges and the outflow of sediments. Of course, then you have to move the harbor, because you cannot maintain the harbor inside. And then the dredging of the different canals that are bringing the big ships inside will stop, and then the canals naturally will be refilled. There are many different things about the different strategies. I have not the time to go through everything, but it's clear that by doing this, we don't immediately consider all the consequences that are related to this kind of choices. But it is very important. One of the major risks is the losing of the salt marshes that have diminished immensely during the centuries. And on the contrary, they can have a fundamental role in calming, let's say, the waves, and in slowing the rhythm of the water, and to stop the process of erosion. So that's something extremely important in order to work on the lagoon. A second fundamental strategy is to assume that the edges are not fixed. So to come back to the idea that there is a perimeter, and you should start to go into this idea of blurring limits of the lagoon, and to start to work with half-dry landscape, or half-wet landscape, or wet landscape, or let's say more dry landscape. So in fact, by not fixing something that we are used to fix, what is the lagoon, what is living in the water, what is living on the land, blurring all these kind of categories. And then you can imagine a map with all strategies of adaptations, imagining that the mitigation process is already ongoing, including the planet working on mitigation process, so that we can save, at the end, Venice. Sorry, I wanted to go back. Okay. At that point, we started to say, okay, let's go to another dimension of design, utopia, a utopian design. Let's start to reframe utopia in a narrative that can bring to another place where we can speak, in fact, of amphibia. So amphibia decide to destroy, in fact, the jetties in order that are today very responsible of the waves and of the speed and the force of the waves entering into the lagoon. By dismantling the jetties, you can refill the inlets using these same materials. Of course, you can imagine that the big infrastructure, the MOSE, is destroyed by this operation. So, and then you reflect on amphibia. So amphibia is a place, this is, for example, rethinking about one of the islands, Murano Island, where maybe you know the production of glass has constructed a tissue of small hangars, atelier, mixed-use spaces that can be rethought, and you can imagine that this can work also in conditions of high tide. So the high tide can be included inside the everyday life and the productivity of the lagoon. This means also to work on small-scale typologies of resilience that are very much related to the century-long history of Venice and its adaptation to the water, this amphibian type of life. Maybe I conclude this part just by quoting some sentences by Italo Calvino, the very important Italian writer, speaking of the future of Venice in the 70s, saying the water city is an archetype of collective imagination and a structure that responds to fundamental anthropological needs, a living archetype that faces utopia. My second case is in Belgium, on the border with Germany, is the Vesdre watershed. The Vesdre, I think in Dutch, a sub-affluent of the Maas, in fact. So this just to say that when we speak of deltas, those deltas are very, very, very big. In fact, I think that when you speak of delta, please, let's start to speak of the Alps also, no? Because, I mean, the story is one. So in this case, this is the human chain that has been organized a couple of weeks ago, and we were there. It's a human chain organized by the Flemish volunteers, an association from Flanders who came for that, and one of the guys told us, I come from Ghent, I came the day after the floods, we had to help people, we came almost every weekend with a bus. If in 20 years the sea covers us, Flemish people, we hope that the Walloons will come to help us too. I think it's a very interesting point, because it's also showing a kind of awareness that we need solidarity. No? We need solidarity in order to look through this. Maybe the resilience is very much also connected to this aspect of social solidarity. And we are doing this work together with the University of Liège, with all the panel of experts, hydrogeologists, ecologists, social sciences, economists, etc. And to go through this complexity, we propose three axes. The first is to look at this river or valley as a subject, so to even go beyond the idea of simply of resource or of an object, but it's really a subject, it's an actor that is present in the discussion. And we consider, for example, that this actor, the river, just occupied in the big flooding that came last year, so in July 2021, the river just occupied its riverbed, the floodplain, totally. Here you see is a superposition of a reading of the 18th century map with the actual occupation of space during the floods last year. So in fact, the logic of the river was very clear, was simply refilling this valley that has been transformed during the time in an industrial valley. This is very important because it's clear that at the moment in which the Industrial Revolution was realized, there was this idea that you could merge this new industry, this type of industry, with a kind of pastoral image, that you could maintain this parallel identity of the valley being at the same time a core of the Industrial Revolution, but also a space of enormous landscape quality. And Victor Hugo, by going through this valley, was describing this valley as the most beautiful valley he knew. The rationalization that were needed in order to have this industrial organization were a lot, especially into the floodplain, but also around, starting with a big transformation of the peat bogs that were drained, and the new species were planted in order to, well, say for economic reasons, destroying completely thousands of hectares of peat bogs was also a very important transformation. And of course also, it's not going backward. Okay, you see in the small pictures the constant construction of risk, the production of risk by filling all the valley with buildings, industries, houses, infrastructures, and of course today we can only say that we have built this condition of risk. The third axis is the river as a socio-economic entity. The river has really used as the corridor along which all this process of this industrial process has developed, as in many other cases. And today, this is the situation we find, which is very far from this initial pastoral image, where in fact all the industrial, old and new industrial buildings and cities are along, exactly on the water. So the way in which we proceed after trying to understand all this complexity is to start to mapping the potential of resilience, which I think is quite close to what was said by the previous discussant by saying that we have to try to make it in a constructive way. No? This transformation is looking for potential. This is, in fact, this plateau, the Haute Fagne, that was, in the past, a very large surface occupied by these peat bogs. And what is very interesting is that 1/3 of the valley is occupied by the former peat bogs, and they are feeding the river for half of the water that is in the river. So if you can slow down the runoff that today is extremely violent, extremely rapid, going towards the river, by restoring the pit box, which means to get rid of the actual type of vegetation and re-establish a topography in which pit box and a little bit of retention could work together, you can immediately reduce in a quite important way what is rejected to the river. On the agricultural plateau, which is very, very beautiful and very, very important, there is a work to be made in reintroducing, for example, the orchards that were playing this role of maintaining, retaining the erosion on the slopes, reintroduce the bocage system that was also there to stabilize the slopes and to retain water. And again, in order not to have that all the plateau is sending all the waters rapidly into the valleys. I'm going very far. There are very important dried valleys where the water is appearing in some moments and disappearing when it's not raining a lot. People are building into dry valleys where the water will come back in a moment or in another with the consequences we can imagine. And all the centers that are on the higher plateau, they should think how to diminish the runoff towards the valley. And this, of course, is the creation of a new infrastructure that could easily become also not only a flood kind of protection, but also a social and ecological infrastructure. I'm going very fast, I'm sorry. The last one is in the flood plain. In the floodplain, of course, we have all the cities, all the industries, and many other infrastructures. So there is an accumulation of capital, an accumulation of very fragile populations that were declining and with a very strong economic problems even before the flooding. So the point is, how can we rethink this valley, considering that maybe this catastrophe can be the starting point for constructing a new vision for a valley that was in need of a vision even before this catastrophe. And so, step by step, starting to clarify what are the potentials of resilience to flooding. I'm very, very limited, just resilience to flooding, in order to transform this situation. One last point is that the climate change in this area of Belgium, in the future we will have, at the horizon 2050, we will have 2 to 3 more episodes like the one of last year, so that's quite terrible. But after 2050, for reasons that I have not the time to explain, this will be reversed. So this type of flooding, big flooding, will be totally maybe disappearing, but the drought will become the fundamental problem. So in this research of resilience to the flooding, we have to cope also with the resilience to the drought. So the first case, the Venice case, the Amphibia case, is also learning from the history of Venice, with this method that has also a Venetian name that for some of the Venetians here could be interesting, but let's say this trial and error method, in which any adaptation work that were realized by the Republic of Venice had to be reversible. That's something important if you think about resilience. And it is also by practicing a policy of conservation to maintain and restore the natural balances that made the living in the lagoon possible. That is what also some of the historians that made incredible research on Venice could reconstruct. In the second case, mapping the potential, so scenarios that draw a future of solidarity for the watershed, where all the watershed is participating to this new resilience. where we have the problem of becoming more resilient to flood and droughts, as I said, but also to increase the socio-economic resilience. So this is where we are in this moment, in which we start a consultation, let's say a participation process, in which the question will be, how could socioeconomic choices enhance and strengthen the flood resilience potential, or the opposite, choices about resilience, which can have consequences on the socioeconomic vision. Of course, we are really imagining totally different types of economic development in function of the resilience we want to build. And you cannot disconnect these two type of discourses. And to conclude, I think that designing resilience should be also because resilience is a kind of politically correct concept. No? Nobody can tell you, no, we don't want to be resilient. Nobody. So we can use the strength of this politically correct concept in order to use design, so resilient design or design for resilience, as a pick lock to open up and to dismantle this frame that I was describing at the beginning of the modern idea of resistance and of protection, of a safe, to make a safe population. So typically the big pillar of biopolitical approach. So by touching the resistance paradigm, we can dismantle the order that is behind it. And we can use design for resilience as this pick lock. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. I hope you're still being awake and active, because we really need your help now and your questions.
I'm not sure if they wanted to invite again the speakers in front like we did before. Ah, there are the chairs. Can I invite you here? But Ellen made a point, because I think that I have a lot of questions, and I see from these presentations really enormous interesting linkages, because I think that Paola is really the activist of DEREC, and that DEREC's extractive economy is a very critical question towards Frank, and also that Tim might also be interested in the value of ecology. But I would also really like to give you the opportunity, because you've been here all day being the best public in the world ever, and still here and longing for a drink, and Chris closing the session. But if there are really things that you would like to put in the discussion now, I'm really happy to have you now. No, you remain easygoing? Okay. Yes. Ah, there you are. Excellent. Nikos.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to pick up on something that Paola mentioned, actually two things. The one was that in order to save Venice, we need to save the planet, right? And the other was a brief reflection that, when we discuss about the deltas, we should also discuss about, the upstream territories, let's say the Alps, right? And I'm thinking today, we heard a lot about, responses to the challenges that we are facing in the deltas, but I'm actually thinking, is this the right scale to address the issues, and if not, what would be the right scale? I mean, spatially speaking, right? Is the delta territory a useful unit? And if not, what would be the next more useful unit? It's a question, I guess, to everyone.
What do you think?
I can say something about scale. Because I think there are different scales working at the same time. The delta is a scale because there's an issue there that is defined on the delta scale. But if you look at labor, which is one of the sorting effects I showed, it's about labor market areas. So people do not want to commute more than 1 hour. If you're higher educated, maybe more. So that also defines that in an economic sense, that is a relevant scale. But if you want to battle unemployment, you better go to neighborhoods. So there's a wide range of scales. It's a multi-scalar, multi-level issue. It's a very popular word, but I think it's very important to connect these scales because they all interact with each other if you talk about resilience and growth. And there was one more dimension I noticed also listening to Dirk. I really talked about cities as generating wealth. But he also mentioned something very important, like there's a distribution of wealth. Do you generate it for just the elite that is now in place with their factories and with their sectors that are important? Or do you also try to redistribute it to the people who are not so well off? And I didn't stress that much in my talk, and I found it very good that Derek mentioned it. And I think that's a very important issue. It's a political issue, because how the market in cities and regions organizes itself, it doesn't automatically redistribute. So there's a very big issue also for governance there to work on about the social justice and injustice. So, and that is also in different scales again. Make it only more complex for you, but it's...
Can I react also for the sake of the discussion? I don't think that the deltas are a scale. They are a part of a system, and the system is larger than the delta. So the question is that in some moments you need absolutely to connect in a system logic all the different parts of the system. So that's why I'm saying from the Alps to the North Sea, because otherwise we will not understand. Then, of course, inside the discussion about adaptation, climate change, sea level rise, we have millions of scales. But maybe for this research, for the delta research, we have to understand that there are relations that cannot be excluded.
No, I agree.
And on which we have to work more.
I also talked about trade relations that cover the whole world. So, but in the end, there is a problem on the scale level of the delta, because they are the flooded area, potentially or not.
But the flooding areas are everywhere, don't imagine.
Yes, I agree, but it doesn't mean that you have to organize it in some place that you can battle the things. And I think then the delta might be a good level to organize things.
Of course, the delta can be a good level. I think that we have really to, especially in the logic of design, you cannot really cut things. Design has a logic, has a need of continuity of relations. And I think it's also where design can become, the design of resilience can become a disruptive tool, because I want to insist on this point. We are not measuring how disrupting. You were speaking of radical transition. I prefer to use the word disruptive, because there is something that has to be really reframed and reopened, or let's say opened in a different way. And I think we are not getting the strength, the power of this disruption.
Or the urgency, maybe.
Sorry?
The urgency also.
And the urgency, yeah.
Because I remember that before you once said, I think, if we save Venice, we save the world. And for me, so you said it the other way around, which for me also somehow connotates that we have certain economies that are global, that are basically, more killing our planet than local economies. So also the globalization as a scale in itself. And this is also where we look, maybe the history also came about today, where you look in history and how we were living locally, then we maybe had a lower impact on our environment than we have now, because now Dutch shrimp go on a plane to Morocco and then they come back. I mean, they fly more often than maybe humans somehow. So how do you see this in scale and disruption? Because, it also means that we have to go back local. Is that an option?
Yes, it's an expensive option.
Yeah?
We call it reshoring, nearshoring. Instead of getting all these things from all over the world, why don't we make them in Europe? If it would have been affordable, we would have done it already. So it means that you have to give up something else to do that. But it might give you a better footprint, might give you better security, might give you less dependence on others. It might be worth it. So, but it's a political issue to...
But I was also wondering that because if we would introduce this tax for CO2 tax, if we would have calculated in everything that we produced up till now, how much it also disrupt the ecology of our planet and would add this value, then we already led a very expensive life but not paying for it. Is that true?
Yeah, you can defend that. Yes, that's. I will
That
not
was
say
the
it's true or not true, but it's...
I know nothing about economy, so this is a genuine question from me. So, no, because this is what Derek called the extractive economy, right, Derek? That's what you meant with extractive economies, that we have this comfort zone that we want to live in, but that we really don't, well, pay for the consequences.
I took off my microphone, so I'm finally silent now. So I think the question of scale is always interesting, but scale is also meaningless because it needs to happen at all scales, and some things are global, like ecology in general, the biosphere, and some things are local, like your friends or a get-together. The whole thing about it is we need to go to an economic systems, practices of production and consumption that are nature positive. So the materials we use and how we use them, the energy we use, the food that we use and produce. And on a small scale, it's perfectly possible already to do it. But it's more expensive, it's not fully developed yet. So I think we need to use design, and that's why I say radical, because it's transforming the root design of our current economic systems of production. And we need to be radical on the long term and do backcasting to identify where is it already happening, bring that community to life, and use design to make visible what's already there, to legitimize it, to empower it, to help the process of learning and social innovation. And I think that can happen locally, but as well in a delta. If at the delta scale the problem is, fine, then take the delta or take an area or start in your neighborhood or with a global value chain. It needs to happen anywhere.
Yeah, Tim, because Tim introduced such a plan already 2 years ago. So are there things of this plan that are actually happening now?
There are already a lot of things happening. We also do a lot of pilot studies, living lab studies already in the Netherlands, and all these ideas are actually we put on the map. So that not everything is new what we put on the map, but existing knowledge we use to develop this map. But we actually received a lot of questions about scale, because we made a map on a national level. And people said, okay, yeah, but if you think from a nature-based perspective, you should think on river basin scale or something like that. And then we should have made Germany, Belgium included in our vision. Now, we didn't do that, but also we did a national scale because also we have to make very important choices on a national level. For instance, where we are going to build these 1 million houses, what do we do with, where will we produce our food in the future concerning sea level rise? I haven't heard about that much about food today, but I think that is a real big challenge. But so we got a lot of questions about that, but also a lot of regions came to us, regional authorities came to us and said, can you please help us develop a vision on a regional scale, because in the regions, there the action takes place. So I think it is very helpful to have these kind of exercises, designing future visions on several skills. So we are now doing this on several regional skills together with regional authorities and several stakeholders. And that is also really helpful to get them into action. So I think we need all these skills.
And do you also intend to scale up, go to the whole Rhine basin?
Yeah?
That'd be nice.
We would love to do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions in the audience? Because I would, yeah.
Yeah, one question. I have the feeling we do talk a lot about the redesigning and the change that is taking place, but I think that we all want change. And I wonder if we all talk about influencing the change, but I wonder if we really do. The fact is that it's already, as you said, it's already happening, or it's not. In what way can we influence that change if we can only do backcasting? Do you understand? It's quite essential.
How he needs to run. Maybe my voice is loud enough. Yeah, so for me, backcasting is a way to influence change, but you need to do it with a lot of people. So it's not us doing the backcasting, but it's sort of the backcasting kind is part of a mindset where you are skill sensitive. So where you think in terms of diversity, in terms of social innovation. So the mindset of transitions I talked about, the transition design type of mindset, is something that policymakers and decision makers in general need to develop. They're completely trained to optimize within their organization and within their sector or subset or department, or and we need at a massive scale this kind of logic that Tim, for example, did. So these maps of the future are not relevant. It's actually ingraining this radical thinking on the long term and this more experimental prototyping mindset on the short term, that we need to do things that we don't know yet or are not sure of, and we need to try it out and then figure out and then learn from it and take the next step, but with a more radical long-term orientation. And that is, I mean, we studied a lot of survivors in historic transitions, and this is what they do. So if we want to survive as a country, we need this on a massive scale. And I think more and more people start to understand this. And I have to correct myself because I blamed the government for keep expanding Schiphol instead of all the warnings. I just saw that they decided today to start reducing the number of flights. So there is hope. Directly, that's the rough. They heard me loud and clear.
But Dirk, talking about hope, because I think you are, as I from the MTV generation, where you had the ad turn off the tab. You remember that one? I still cannot have tabs running because then I see the video and it was MTV. And so what about our children? Do you think that they'll be better than us? Can we have hope that the newer generation, because you're a social scientist, are we transforming them, or are we basically training them the same way?
I think it's completely lame to wait for future generations. So it's us basically, part of the problem and the solution. I do see that newer the more people grow up being aware of the globe and of networks and being connected, the more this resilience mindset is spreading globally. So this is sort of a natural evolution culturally, but it won't happen fast enough to prevent the major shocks from biodiversity loss and climate change. So we need to do something much more drastically in the now.
But who has to do something then? Like, is it the
all
government?
of us
is
together,
it the government?
us
Like
scientists, so we can write more reports, but we actually need to connect to companies and organizations to actually build the transitions. We need to use our platforms to criticize business as usual and to say this is not sustainable and this needs to stop. And then a lot of people would call me activist. But I have all the science behind me, and actually I think there is, it's a very normative thing to say, let's study it and let's start another project to figure out what the problem is.
I have to start building. Yeah, Paula, please.
No, I would like to react to the question of the what can we do more and different from what we already did, not we personally, but what was already done, for example, in another moment of transition that were the 70s, no? Because at the beginning of the 70s, limits to growth, the crisis, the gasoline crisis, a social crisis, an economic crisis, there were all the elements, no, to go towards a transition. And many thought that it was the case. Culturally, especially, it was very, very clear that if you read the novels of the time or the movies of the time, you see how much there was this idea that a transition was arriving. But then we forgot everything. And I don't know if you know this novel, Ecotopia. Someone has read Ecotopia? It's very interesting. It's from the 70s, and it's the idea that California, at a certain moment, abandoned the US. So the US are divided in two parts, where Californians, more or less Californian part, goes into the direction of a strong radical transition on energy, reuse, recycle, even social behaviors, etc. And all the themes we are discussing today were discussed in that book. Exactly, there is nothing new. And more than 50 years, half a century has passed. So I have the impression that the transition we are discussing today is a kind of a second occasion, no? When you say, okay, you didn't get at the first, you have the second one. But the themes are really the same. The question of, for example, the ecological theme was completely already framed. The soil importance, going back to the understanding of soils, of agriculture, a new relation with nature. I mean, these were themes that were already there. Economically, it was the abandon of the big industry, so imagining another world. Work was transforming, was becoming something different. So I think that maybe to understand why today, because today we are not going in the direction of the transition. We should remember that the IPCC, as the last report, also said that we are not diminishing the emissions. We are always stuck there. So we are not going in the direction of the transition in this moment. So I think we have to be very alerted, because it already happened half a century ago that we didn't go at the end. And on the contrary, a systematic process of hiding, I think, certain themes has been provided.
Yeah. We have to round up, so maybe last word, Tim?
Maybe very short, but I think we really need another language, because as scientists we have been writing a lot of reports and publications, and but also a lot of alarming messages about everything that's going wrong. And I think also there are a lot of people now that from climate denial, you now have more climate anxiety. And I think we have to mobilize and energize everybody that we still can move in the right direction. And I think that the power of design is that we can show how a desired future looks like, and then you can mobilize and create enthusiasm with a lot of people to start acting. I think that really helps.
We need new activism. Thank you so much for your contribution. I think we really enjoyed this, and we hope to discuss with you further. So I really want to thank them with you. And I'm giving the word to Chris.
Discourse on the transition. I would like to have some occasions.
You're safe.
Okay, I want to keep it very short. Maybe to start with, Annemiek Nijhoff mentioned that we should all be emulsifiers. And Derek and Paulo said we need to be activists. So I think all those elements should be there. I think that the plan presented by Han Meijer captures a lot of elements we discussed today. The component of activism, it was a provocative design. It was not well received by the Port Authority, but also it was grounded upon science, and it looked back and it made a projection. It was a sort of inclusive process. So I think there were many elements which are relevant and has been discussed today. I feel that we made a start, at least to acknowledge that there is a need for appealing futures. There is a need to have a clear idea how to get there. I also want to say that we had a sort of invitation to think about, to contribute to the next IPCC reporting, which should be about how to really make a difference and how to enforce that things are really going to change, so that there is a need for appealing futures and steps to get there. Tomorrow we will go deeper into design and design-based research. We will go deeper into the deltas and the challenges of the deltas. At the end, we hope to really have you on board to take the next step. And I think what Bas said, the time is really there to join forces and to be maybe an activist, but also to jointly work on those pathways. What I want to do is stop here, that we have a drink, and I think a couple of you are staying here. I don't know how many of you, but we will stay in touch, and hopefully you are tomorrow also attending the second day. And there is also an excursion on the third day where we will look at some, you can say, delta designs which has been implemented. So let's go to the bar, yeah? Thank you very much.